Welcome to the Integrating SignalR with ASP.NET Core and Vue micro course. My name is Sean Wildermuth of Wilderminds. In this short course, I'll show you how to integrate with SignalR and Vue. I'll start out by showing you how to create a Vue library. I'll integrate it as a Vue plugin. I'll show you how to integrate SignalR with Vuex as well. And then I'll show you how to call into SignalR, not just get notifications of it from within a Vue project. It's important that you know that this course isn't about teaching SignalR or how to integrate it with ASP.NET alone. This is not an introduction to SignalR. There's another micro course I have that you can certainly take to see how all that works. Before digging in, you should be familiar with SignalR already, and if you've taken Wildermind's SignalR micro course, you'll be really prepared with the same sort of project that we did in that course. This short course is just focusing on SignalR inside of a Vue project. We're covering only client-side code. Let's get started. Let's start by showing you the starting project. If you open up a browser to github.com/wildermindscourses, you'll see a number of the sample projects for our courses, and the one you're looking for is SignalR with Vue. You can also get to that by just saying github.com/wildermindscourses/SignalR with Vue. And this will give you the starting point for the project that we're going to be building. If you're not that familiar with Git, you can just click this green button and download it as a zip file. Otherwise, I would certainly suggest you clone it. So I've opened up the project here in Visual Studio. Let's run this project and then I'll show you the code behind it real quick. This project really only has 2 pages. It has a Help Center page, which is the home page, where we can put in a problem we're having. The printer doesn't work. If you've seen the microcourse on SignalR and ASP.NET Core, you'll know that this joke never gets old. It simply reports the problem so that a call center can handle it. And the call center is simply a call log of all the calls that are added to the system, and then it will allow us to open it, review it, and then mark it as answered. Once we mark it as answered, it will go away. And in our Vue project, this all works, assuming you're the only one answering calls. What we'd like to do is integrate SignalR into adding to this call log or removing from the call log as other users are adding or removing calls to this call log. It's a very typical use of SignalR to simply provide these notifications to these other browsers or these other apps as things are happening in real time. So back here in the code, there's only a couple of things to know about. First, inside the hubs directory, there's a call hub class, and this is just the 2 kinds of calls that we're going to support in SignalR. We're going to allow a message called call answered to tell anyone listening that a call has been handled. In essence, it doesn't need to be handled anymore, and they can remove it in the UI if they want. And the other call is a new call. So a new call has been added to the system and should be displayed in whatever UI is listening for this. That's the back end. On the front end, we simply have a Vue project, and this Vue project was built using the Vue CLI, so it uses single-page applications, and then a number of systems, including Vuex for the store and Vue router for the router, because the router is used to show both the list of calls as well as the page where calls can be answered. Now that we've looked at the code briefly, let's go ahead and integrate SignalR into this project. So now let's create a client and integrate into Vue with that client. The first thing we're going to need to do, and we're going to really be working inside the Vue project at this point, is to go to the package.json, because we actually need a new library here, a new dependency, and that's going to be ASP.NET/SignalR. This ASP.NET/SignalR project is for when you're calling to SignalR on top of ASP.NET Core. There's also a SignalR project that you could call if you're using it against earlier versions of SignalR. And I'm going to use 1.1.2. There's some previews out, but I'm not going to touch those yet. And then we'll want to create a new JavaScript file here, or TypeScript if that's what you're using. And I'm going to call it the callhub.js. This will be a component that we can use inside of Vue that handles the integration with SignalR. First thing we'll need to do is import from ASP.NET SignalR. And what we're going to get here is we could get everything, but we actually just need a hub connection builder. That is an object that can create a connection for us. And one way to do this is to create a new class. So I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it the call hub, and I'm going to create a constructor for it. In this constructor, we'll actually build up the actual connection to the hub. So now that we have the constructor, let's go ahead and create a new member to the call hub that I'm just going to call client. You can call it anything you want, but this will be a member of the class that can be referenced by users of the call hub. And so this is the way they're going to get at the SignalR functionality. And we're going to create the new client by creating a new hub connection builder object. And then from there, we'll use a fluent syntax. We're going to say with URL, and this is where we're going to specify what the URL to the SignalR hub is. If we go ahead and open up that startup.cs and look near the bottom, we'll actually see that in the use SignalR part of ASP.NET Core that we're mapping this to a specific URL, and this URL is API/callhub. Could be anything you want, but that's what the example uses. So I'll copy that directly into here. This could be an absolute URL as well if you're not hosted in the same web project. This will normalize this relative URL for us to make it a little easier. And then we're going to say .build. This .build says go ahead and create this connection, but it's not actually going to start the connection. We want to control how that started. So we'll create a method on our class, or function on a class if you prefer, called start. And all we'll do here is call client.start. Now we could expose this directly and make sure everyone calls it, but I like having its own call here just so it's a little clearer, and I could add logging if I wanted to, those sorts of things. And then finally, I'll export a new instance of this. Now I'm exporting a new instance on purpose because I want this to be a singleton. I want there to be only one instance of this class, and that everybody that gets a reference to it will get that single instance. And the reason for this is you want start to happen just once. You don't want to have a bunch of different clients have their own copies of Call Hub and then all have different connections to it. The API would support it, but it wouldn't make any sense. You really want to have that centralized within your one Vue application. Now that we have the Call Hub specified, let's go ahead and use it in our call list. Now that we have a class that represents this, let's use it with our call list. Over here in Visual Studio, I have this view in here that says call list, and I could integrate it directly with this view, but I want to do it at a higher level. But I'm going to show you that we can really do it from whatever level you want. But I'm going to start with the app.view, which is simply the container that has the main page that we're going to be dealing with. You'll notice that this app.view has the router view for each of the elements, as well as a short div here to show an error if it happens somewhere in the application. What's important here is that we're getting and using the store for this component. So I'm going to go ahead and add a mounted function here. And this is part of the lifecycle of Vue to allow me to do something once this main component has been mounted into our application. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and import the call hub from Call Hub, right? And we're going to get that single instance that we want. Even though this is in an app.view, if you're not using single file components, you could do this in the individual files as well. And so at this point, I can use that Call Hub client. Remember, that's the object that is actually the SignalR object. And I'm going to call on. And this on is going to be when I get a message from the server. Because an important idea here, we go back to the home page, is that this page has nothing to do with Vue. This is going to do some simple standard HTML work and then send a post up to the server, and the server is going to go ahead and add it to the database. And so inside of the code for that controller, let me open this back up to the home controller. We actually have a reference to this hub context, to this object that knows how to call the hub from within the server. And then down here, when someone posts a new call, we're actually using it to say, hey, go alert everybody that there's a new call through SignalR, anyone who's listening. And so what it ends up being is the name of this method is really what we're listening for. Anyone calling a method called new call. So back here, we'll just put new call, and then we'll put a function that is going to alert us about the new call. And in fact, we know by looking at the hub that new call passes us an object that represents that new call. And because of that, we can just take in that, let's call it new call. So we have an opportunity to add it to our data, right? And this could be adding it to this components data, but in our case, since we're using Vuex, we actually have the store. And let's talk about the store for just a minute. I do suggest that most applications of a decent size use the store. So if we open up the store.js, we're going to come down here and see there is a mutation called add call. And this will just add a call to the list of calls that are going to be displayed on that page. And then this mutation takes a second parameter called call, which is an object that represents the call we're going to show. You can see that it's just pushing it into the state. So we come back here to app view. What we're going to want to do is go to that store and just say we want to commit add call, which is the name of the mutation, and then the new call, which is the data that we're being sent that represents the new call, into the new list. Since we've made a change to the Vue application, we're going to want to make sure that it's building in the background. Because of some of the peculiarities with the way that Visual Studio works right now, you'll have to do this in a console window. If you just right-click on Client and say Open in Command Line, assuming you have that plugin, or just open up the client directory itself, you're going to want to just say npm run watch. Run tells npm to start up a script inside the package.json, which we've already defined, and one of them is called watch, and this will simply build the Vue application using the build CLI and then watch for changes. So as we make additional changes, it'll go ahead and rebuild it. You can see here it says watching for changes. This might be unfamiliar depending on how you've been using Vue. So if I open up two browsers, let me just refresh them. I'm opening up two browsers because I want to be able to add from the Help Center here and have it magically show up here without any refresh happening. That's the magic of SignalR. Let me just put in a printer problem because that joke never gets old. And if I save it, you can see that the other browser or the other machine or the other type of browser or the app you have running on a phone someplace will get notified about this change. We can actually see includes all the information we had, even though we've never called from the server. We've actually got that call from the notification from SignalR. And that's why, even though we had this working with forcing refreshes of the browser, SignalR is going to allow us to actually push these down to the client. If we duplicate this tab, and let's just pull it down here, and let's add another one, you see it appears in all the different browsers as soon as the server side kicks that hub to send those messages down to whoever's listening. If we look at the console inside of the browser, you'll see that we're actually getting some informational messages in here about how it's actually calling it. And this can be helpful to do a couple of things. One, to know that it's connecting to your API correctly. So if you're having errors, they'll show up here. You'll also see that it's going to use whatever type of connection it can. And in this case, it's using a WebSocket because the WebSocket between the client and the server is the best method. As you get behind firewalls and proxies and other network infrastructures, you might see this drop down into polling or into using long-lived connections and things like that. And so this is a way for you to really debug those situations as well. So here we've used Call Hub directly from the main component in our application, the one that loads all the other components and uses the router and such. Let's talk about integrating this as a plugin instead. You might imagine using this where you have more than one Vue application and you want to be able to plug it in instead of having to do this integration as a one-off. Now let's use this Call Hub that we've created as a plugin instead. Back in Visual Studio, if you go into the app.view, we've created an instance of the Call Hub and then we're using it and mounted of this main app view. But I don't really like that as a good starting point. So I'm just going to comment this out. I'll leave this in so you'll have this as the code in the project later in case you wanted it. But instead of integrating there, what we're going to want to do in order to make it a plugin is just go ahead and create a new JavaScript file that I'll call the Call Hub plugin. Now, I probably would have done this all in one JavaScript file originally, but I want to keep the Call Hub separate in this case and just have the plugin elements in its own file. And so first I'm going to need the Call Hub from the Call Hub. And in order to just do a plugin, you're just going to need to export a default object. That object's going to have a function on it called install. And this install takes in two pieces of information. The main Vue object, and then any options that you include. Though we're not going to use any of the options, but I'll leave it there for now. The first thing I'm going to want to do when we install this is go ahead and call start. Because we're doing this at a Vue level, I'm going to go ahead and start listening immediately, even though later we might be adding these listeners. The listeners do not have to be instantiated before we call start, so that becomes pretty simple. And then I'm just going to use the Vue object and add to its prototype a Call Hub object. So in this case, I'm adding to the prototype this $Call Hub that will be available throughout the entire application. Instead of having it centralized at the main view, this idea allows each view to really handle and register their own listeners or to call back to the hub on its own without it having to be centralized in one place. You really give everyone a bite at the apple of the Call Hub. In order to use this, we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to go to the main.js. and we're going to import the plugin. And once we have this plugin, we're going to need to say vue.use and then the call hub plugin. When you create a plugin for Vue, this is how you do it. You may have done this with the router. You may have done this with any Vue libraries that you're using, the vue.use. In fact, we'll see here in the router that we have that same pattern here. Router at some point has an object that has an install function on it that Vue is going to call because we've done this vue.use. So we're instantiating the plugin, and so that means all the code in here should have access to it. So how do we do what we were going to do inside of the app.vue? How do we do this in a more centralized way? So let's open up the views and let's go straight to the call list. Since the call list is where we're defining that call list, why don't we do the work of integrating with SignalR as close to possible? So down here we have this mounted function, and this is where it's actually calling load to load up all the data from the server. Since we don't want to start listening for events until that load is done, because we don't want them conflicting, getting a new one that happened to be returned when we called for data to the server, we can go ahead on this load and just add a then. So from here, it's very similar to what we wanted to do before. We're simply going to say this.callHub, which is that globally available version we talked about. We're going to go to the client and we're going to call on, and it's going to be that new call just like we did before. And then we'll do a callback for when it's called. It's important that I'm using an arrow function here because we don't want to lose the this pointer that's inside the load here. Notice we're also using the arrow here. And so we can say this.store.commit add call, and then the parameter here is going to be that new call, right? So we can go ahead and add it as the second parameter. With this new method after load, so if we just include one from Jake, printer won't print, and we save it, we can see it appear here on the right-hand side. So back in Visual Studio, if we go ahead and look at that call list component, we've done essentially the same thing, but we've done it pretty deep inside of our application. For applications are fairly large, using a plugin to allow you to do whatever work needs to be done on a global basis so that everyone has access to this magic call hub object. You can really decide to do this. But there is one other way that I quite like. And if you're using Vuex in your Vue projects, like I probably suggest you do, we can actually integrate directly with Vue. And if all of this is about data and it's not really about figuring out how to show it or how to explain it, because you'll notice that most of the examples I've shown here, instead of adding to the state of the components, we're using the store to centralize that. Why not just integrate directly into Vue itself? Let's do that next. Now let's go ahead and integrate with Vuex. Back in Visual Studio, I'm going to open up that call list. I'm just going to come out how we're integrating with the call list directly, because we're going to do it with Vuex instead. That also means here in main, I need to comment out that we're using the plugin, because we're not going to use it in any of that sense. We're going to integrate directly into Vuex itself. We're going to continue to use the hub, but not the plugin. So we go ahead and open up the store. Let's go ahead and import the call hub from call hub, right? We're getting that instance we're going to need. And we're just going to change this a little. Instead of exporting the default as this new instance of the store, let's just create a call called the store. And down here, we'll go ahead and export default and just include that store, right? The reason I'm doing this is so I can do a little work after the store has been generated and integrate with the call hub down here. So here I'm just going to add to this before we actually export this, callhub.client.on. And then just like we did before, I'm going to call the store directly to do that commit. And then I'll need to include the new call, which of course we're being passed in when the client is called back on this. Nothing different. And here we can just tell it to call hub start. Now this gives us one point of integration with SignalR that we're doing it directly inside of the store. This works really well, in my opinion, because all of the SignalR calls we're dealing with are about changes to the data. And since we're controlling all the data here, why does the Vue have to know about any of these changes at all? The store itself is the one going to be responsible, therefore we can hide all this complexity inside the store. And just to prove it works, let's go ahead and refresh our call log so we get the latest version of the code. And I'll just add a new problem from Jackie. Printer is on the fritz. Still working now that we're integrated at the Vue level, because all we're doing is changing the data that everything is bound to. And so, of course, it'll continue to work. So those are the 3 ways I've seen as good ways to integrate SignalR with Vuex. But we have one more thing we want to do, and that is to make a call in order to have messages sent to other clients as well. So we're not just listening, but we're also posting up changes to the server. Let's do that next. Now let's call the hub from the client so we can see how that works. So here back in Visual Studio, we have a problem, and that is we're removing the calls here inside of our Vuex object. We're actually pushing a change to the API, and we might want to notify everyone else that we're making this call. So how do we make this happen? And this is going to be pretty similar in different scenarios, but works really well because we're here in the store, because what we really want to do is here, after the commit to remove the call, we'd like to be able to call the call hub, go to the client, and we're going to invoke the name of the hub call. So when we invoke, we're going to be invoking something in the call hub. And so what are we going to be calling? We're going to be calling this call answered, right? Because we're going to take the call in for call answered and then pass it to everyone else that's listening to it, not us. That's what this other specifies, that this call itself has been answered. And we'll go ahead and pass in the call itself. So back here in the call, we're going to say call answered, and we're just going to pass in that call object that we have. Now you may be wondering why we're calling invoke. There's actually 2 methods to calling the server. There's invoke and send. Send is a fire and forget. So in fact, the call is made up to the server, queued up, and just returned very quickly. You're not going to get any error information or return result from it. It's a simple fire and forget. So it's actually much quicker than it would be if you need to check for errors or anything like that. I tend to call invoke unless I really can think about this as a fire and forget, because this will wait for the execution of the call to happen and then return it. And in this case, I really want that to happen. So now that we have this call done, we're going to need a way to have someone be listening for this. And of course, we're the real listener for it. So let's go ahead and create another on. So we'll say call hub client on, and it's going to be that same call answered. You can certainly do something with the magic strings if you'd like. And here we're just going to commit the same thing we did here. We're going to call store.commit, remove call, and pass in that new call. In a single instance of the web page here, this calling up to the server won't actually cause this to happen. Of course, we've already done it here, so we don't really want it to happen. That's why when we designed the call hub, we told it to call others. We don't want it calling back into ourselves, but it will call everyone else. So I'll actually show you this working by showing you again multiple browsers so that we can see removing in one should remove them in another. So let's go ahead and open up the browser. And now if we go ahead and open up the JAK key and just mark it as answered, we'll see that it disappears from both browsers. And this would be true whether the browsers are on the same machine or not. Let's show it again. I'll remove the Bob Smith, which is in the middle, not just the last one. That one goes away. I'll get rid of the Sean one because we fixed the printer. And I can feel like we're all clean now. This simply shows you that you can use SignalR to send messages across to other browsers, not just from the server. Let's wrap up this module. So we've talked about integrating SignalR into a Vue project hosted within ASP.NET Core. I've shown you how to integrate SignalR into your Vue projects. I've shown you how you can integrate it deeply or shallowly into your Vue projects, whether you want to isolate it inside of Vuex, whether you want to do it globally, or you just want to include a library and go about it. And I've shown you how to handle both notifications to the server as well as from the server. This has been integrating SignalR with ASP.NET Core and Vue. My name is Sean Wildermuth of Wilderminds. Thanks for joining me.